stuff, this is a good thing to think about because it will lower your food bill quite a bit with some minimal inputs from as far as seeds and that sort of thing. One of the main reasons is it's the freshest food you can get, and there's nothing that compares between a store-bought tomato and one that was picked in your garden just an hour ago when you eat it. Shipping and storage times means that vegetables can be days to a week or more old by the time it gets to your supermarket. And then if you bring it home and it sits in your refrigerator for a few more days, it's old by the time you eat it. By growing your own, you also can have varieties that you can't find in the store. Let's say you like a particular kind of summer squash and it just usually isn't in the store. And by starting your own seeds, you have an even bigger variety of things that you can find that you maybe can't find in the store or even at the garden center when you're looking for plants to put in a garden. Planting a garden adds nutritious foods to your diet. Most of the things we grow in our gardens are fruits and vegetables, and they're always telling us we need to eat more fruits and vegetables. It provides exercise and fresh air, and we know that both of those things are good also, and people need to get out and do more of those. It's a family-friendly activity. Everyone from toddlers up to grandpa and grandma can participate in gardening if you want. And some people just like the pride in accomplishment, saying that I grew these tomatoes and I grew these beans and I made this salsa from the things in my garden. So that's another reason that people like to do gardening. Deciding what to plant. Okay, so you're all ready to garden now. And what should you look at as far as deciding what to plant? A couple things to consider. Your personal tastes, plant what you like to eat and will eat. There's no sense planting artichokes if you don't want to eat artichokes or eggplant. And then another thing to look at is the space that you have to grow vegetables. Some vegetables are space hogs and some of them produce quite a bit in a very small space. So you might want to look at how big is your garden before you start to plan what to plant. Also look at the site conditions of your garden space. Do you have sun all day or do you have part shade? Or maybe part of the day when your house or a tree or another building shades your garden site. So then you'll have to choose plants according to those that maybe don't require full sun all day. And then you need to decide whether you're going to use seeds or start with plants. So those are some of the things you might want to take into consideration. How do you know whether to do seeds or plants? Okay, plants should be used when the days to maturity are longer than the growing season. So things like tomatoes and peppers and Brussels sprouts and eggplants, those things all take more growing season, many more days to become mature and ready to pick than we have here in Wisconsin. And so for those plants, you probably want to start with transplants. Days to maturity are usually figured from when you put the seed in the ground or when you transplant the starter plant into your garden. So if you have 65-day tomatoes, it means you can expect the first tomatoes in a normal growing season about 65 days after you put the plant in the ground. There are a couple of plants though that you should not probably start from seed or even buy in the garden center because it's not worth it. Cucumbers, melons, and squash, that whole family of plants called cucurbits, do not transplant very well because they have very tender roots and they're very sensitive to being pushed around or disturbed. And although you think, well, I'm going to get a start on this, very often the seeds that you put in the ground will catch up with the ones that you have from the garden center, and you'll pay much less for a package of seeds than you will for the individual plants. Seeds should be used for all other plants, and those are peas, beans, lettuce, beets, carrots, and all of those vegetables that we don't have to start in pots. Most root vegetables you don't want to start in pots either, like carrots and those, because you want that root to grow long into the ground. And if you transplant it, you're probably going to end up curling it or kinking it or something, and then that's the way your carrot's going to grow. When you're buying seeds, things to look for, you might want to look at the description really carefully, because there are many different kinds of beans, but they fall into two categories: pole beans and bush beans. Bush beans maybe get 2 feet high, maybe a little more. Pole beans can get to be 8 or 10 feet tall. And so if you plant pole beans, you're going to have a fence or a trellis or some structure for them to grow up on. They're good for saving space, because you can probably plant more beans, pole beans, in the same space as you can bush beans, but they also have to have a support. Another category of vegetables is tomatoes. There are 2 kinds of tomatoes, besides all the varieties like heirlooms and plum tomatoes and slicers and all that. There's a determinate tomato, which means the plant grows kind of like a small bush. It gets to be about 3 feet tall, and most of the tomatoes on it will ripen over the course of maybe a month or so, maybe 5 weeks. Then there's indeterminate tomatoes, and the vines on these will keep going until they're killed by frost. So they can grow to be 8, 10, 12 feet long. And these are the kinds of tomatoes that need to be staked or put in a cage or put on a trellis or some sort of structure. Otherwise, your tomatoes will be lying on the ground, and they'll be get snails and things like that in them, and diseases. So be careful when you're buying the tomatoes. If you're going to get indeterminate tomatoes, then you are going to have to provide some kind of structure for those also. And then when you get into sweet corn, there's a tremendous number of varieties there, and there are different kinds that can't be grown next to each other and such. So that's a whole another ball game. But generally the corn will grow to the same height and the days of maturity and that sort of thing. So you don't have to worry too much about whether you have to stake those or not. Then days to maturity. In Wisconsin, we probably want to look at vegetables that will mature in about 100 days, because our growing season is not that long, and you want to have something that actually gets ripe and able to pick it before the frost kills the plant. Special qualities of a variety. For example, you can get purple beans, you can get all different sizes of tomatoes, you can get different colors of flowers and things like that. So again, look for the some special quality maybe that you want in the seed. Disease resistance is important for some crops, and as well as some flowers. For example, some flowers get mildew and other diseases. Same thing with tomatoes and beans and things like that. Cucumbers are another group and squashes that tend to get mildew. So if you can find a disease that's mildew resistant, that means you're going to have less problems with those kinds of things than if you have a seed that's not. What kind of growing conditions do you have? If you are going to have part shade in your garden, you're probably better off with root vegetables like carrots and beets and lettuce, spinach. Those will grow in part shade. If you're going for tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, squash, corn, peppers, those type of things, you're going to need pretty much full sun in order for them to produce well. And there's many different sources for seeds. Seed catalogs probably give you the best descriptions and the most information and the widest variety. There, you can also pick up seeds a lot of times at hardware stores and big box stores, although you generally get a smaller quantity in those packages and you have a much more limited choice as to what you are able to have. Also, you kind of never know how those seeds were taken care of. They could have sat in some cold weather somewhere, some warehouse for a while. So if you order from seed catalogs, those people are in the business for their seeds, and they're going to make sure that they're quality seeds. When you're buying plants, some things to look for. Look very carefully for signs that there might be damage or insects on the plants. And this could be like holes in the leaves, or if the leaves look kind of mottled, they're kind of like light and dark green scattered, or some of the leaves are really kind of yellowish looking. If you see like fuzzy growths or mold looking things on the leaves, that could indicate diseases. And so you want to check the plant over really well to make sure that it's a nice, healthy looking plant. Also check the root ball. There should be lots of white roots, not brown or mushy roots, and they should fill the pot, but not just be jammed in there and circling around the bottom of the pot. In order to do that, you just kind of squeeze the container a little bit or tap it on your other hand, and then put the stem of the plant between your fingers of one hand, and then just turn the pot over and lift it off to check the roots. It's not going to hurt the plant. You might get your fingers dirty and you might lose a little dirt, but it's better to know that your plant has a healthy root system also. You want to avoid plants that are already blooming, even though it's tempting to say, oh, this one's got a really good head start because it's got blossoms on it. It's even got a couple little tomatoes on it. But actually that plant is going to suffer more from the transplant shock than if you chose a plant that didn't have any open blossoms on it and no small fruits. So you want that plant, when you first put it in the ground, to spend most of its energy on growing enough roots to support the plant for the rest of the summer than you do for it to be putting all its energy into those little fruits that are already growing. And again, use reputable dealers. Garden centers are a good thing. Many times big box stores and that kind of thing have garden centers also, but they're just temporary. And often the people who are staffing those are not trained people who know a lot about the plants. If you go to some place that sells plants year round, you are going to be talking to people who are in it for their living, and they're going to be more knowledgeable. Okay, when we get around to actually planting your garden, you need to decide where to plant. And there's a bunch of references in that resource handout. And also a handout called How to Start a Veggie Garden that give a lot more details that I'm covering, but here are some highlights of starting a new garden. We talked earlier about most vegetables need 6 to 8 hours of sun all day. If we're talking about flower gardens, various different flower varieties need more sun, some than others. We know that there are sun varieties and shade varieties, so be sure that you choose a variety, again, for the way the site is that you want to plant it in. And you can't expect a full sun plant to do well in the shade or a shade plant to do well in the sun. So check how the shadows are going to fall and how much sunlight you need all day. Don't plant near a black walnut tree, whether it's alive or dead. Black walnut trees have a substance in them called juglone, which inhibits plant growth of many plant species. So there are a few that will survive under a black walnut tree, but generally a vegetable garden is not among those plants. And there are a few flower varieties, but in general, it's best to plant a ground cover there or grass or something. Also, don't plant where there was a black walnut tree if the roots are still in the ground. And you also don't want to put anything from a walnut tree like branches or leaves or anything into your compost pile either, because that chemical sticks around for quite a while. If you're starting a new garden, it pays to do a soil test. They're not expensive. It's $15 for a basic soil test, and it gives you the phosphorus, potassium, and nitrogen content of your soil, the pH, and then in that report, they will tell you exactly how much fertilizer and what kind to put on the soil when you till it up for your garden to make for the best gardening conditions. Also try to choose an area that is pretty flat. Avoid places that have a slope, humps, low areas. Think about what was growing there previously. If you're trying to garden where there used to be a gravel driveway, for example, that's not going to do real well. So think about that. If you have a slope and that's the only place to garden, you might try doing a little bit of terracing. So in other words, you build a kind of a retaining wall, and then you have a flat surface, and then you build another retaining wall and another flat surface. And that does work really well for growing plants, sort of like you think of those terraced rice paddies in China. Then you have to decide whether you want to do a raised bed or you want to do in-ground gardening. Raised beds have a couple of advantages and a few disadvantages. They generally warm up earlier in the spring, but they might require a little more watering during the year. Raised beds bring the gardening up a little closer for people who have trouble bending over or kneeling. So that makes it a little bit higher, and a raised bed can be anywhere from 2 to 4 inches above the ground around it, all the way to a foot or 2 feet, depending on how tall you want the raised beds to be. And because the bed has a border around it of some kind, generally, you're not dealing with weeds creeping into the bed from your lawn or whatever else is around there. Raised beds are probably also indicated if you want to put a garden where that gravel driveway used to be. That's not going to be a very good place for a garden. However, if you do a raised garden there and bring in garden soil, you can garden in that spot. Think about animal pest control. Do you see those wild critters in your yard all the time? The little bunnies and the really cute little deer. Because if you plant a garden and you know that they're around, they will find your garden too. And they like their veggies just as much as you do. So think about what are you going to do to keep the critters out of your garden. And as far as insects, if you know that you have infestations of certain insects, things like row covers, it's a really lightweight, non-woven fabric that lets the air and the water and the light through, but keeps the insects off your plants. And if you're going to be doing any digging in the ground to create this new garden, be sure you call Digger's Hotline before you start digging. You have to give them 3 days notice, and they will send someone out to mark your utility lines. And this is really important because if you dig into a gas or an electric line, it could be life-threatening. And if you happen to hit your neighbor's cable line, you are going to have a neighborhood of people who aren't going to be very happy with you for putting out their cable and their internet and all that sort of thing. And the kicker is you are responsible for the repair of that utility if you do not call Digger's Hotline before you dig. So they will come out and they'll mark it. They have all those little flags that they'll put there so you know exactly where to not dig. And if you have to dig in that area, then ask how you can do that safely. When to plant. Okay, we generally have vegetables, and flowers too kind of fall into this category. There are some that like it really hot and some that don't like it hot. So we have to decide when we're going to plant some of these plants. Most plants do not grow real well below 50 degrees daytime temperatures. Flowers, there's a few like pansies and some of those that will actually almost overwinter in Wisconsin where we are. But generally most plants, and especially most vegetable plants like the temperatures at least 50 degrees. And that means during the daytime. Now, if you're talking about warm season vegetables, they like it at least 50 degrees at night too. So some of the cool season vegetables, those that you can plant as soon as you can work the soil, would be beets, peas, carrots, cabbage, onions, broccoli, usually from transplants, greens of all kinds, radishes, turnips, lettuce. Those you could plant like as soon as the soil can be worked. The ones in the warm season group, like corn, squash, cucumbers, beans, don't plant those until the soil temperature reaches about 60 degrees and the nighttime temperatures stay at about 50 or greater, because these plants will actually be stunted by cold weather and just really not grow well at all. In addition to the cool season ones, potatoes are another cool season crop. We're having a really, really cold spring this year. Some people say to plant your potatoes on Good Friday. That can vary anywhere from March 22nd or 20th to April 20th. So that's really not a good thing either. You want to go by soil temperature, and there is actually a gadget called a soil thermometer that you stick in the ground. It's kind of like a meat thermometer, but you stick it in the ground and it measures soil temperature. So you can do that. You can probably stick a regular thermometer in, but you have to go down about 2 to 4 inches. Cool season. Yes.
Can I interrupt for a second?
Yeah.
There was a question of what zone are we in central Wisconsin here? Because there's a gal who moved from southeastern part, which was zone 4, and she just wanted to know what central Wisconsin was.
We're zone 4 right here in central Wisconsin. You go a little bit more north and west and you could be getting into zone 3B. But right here in the central part of the state, we're mostly zone 4, either 4A or 4B if you want to get even more technical. The lower lying areas like around Black River Falls, and those are sometimes 4A. And then some of the higher elevations are 4B. And way in the southern part of the state, there is some zone 5 when you get down towards Madison and Milwaukee and along the lake, Lake Michigan. But generally, right here, we're about 4.
All right, and then there was another comment that just said, half my garden is a raised bed, but I have problems with the birds helping out. Mostly when I start planting, and she has a fence all around.
Yeah, the birds fly over the top of the fence, of course, and they really like those little like shoots of peas and beans, sometimes lettuce and that. What I would suggest is one of those floating row covers, or even just a really lightweight piece of fabric that you put over those rows until the plants get about 1 inch high, and then they get kind of too big for the birds to really care about. But yes, I have problems with that too. I'll go out there and find half the row of peas has been pulled out and it's just gone. So yeah, covering them, even like a mesh screening thing, but of course the holes have to be small enough that they can't pull it out between the mesh screening. But I hope that helps a little bit. It gives you some ideas.
All right, thanks, Donna. I'll leave you be for a little bit again.
Okay. How can you tell when the soil is ready to be planted? And the test you use is to squeeze a handful of soil. And if it holds together when you release it from squeezing it, but it crumbles easily when you touch it, that soil has the correct consistency in that it's not too wet and not too dry. Wet soil is more of a problem almost than dry soil, especially here we have at least the northwest half of the county is heavy clay soil. And if you start working in clay soil when it's too wet, you're going to have big clumps or clods that are just almost impossible to break up for the rest of the growing season. So don't be too eager to plant too soon. A couple years ago, we had a very, very, very wet spring, and some of my friends did not put in gardens until like the 15th of June, but those gardens caught up by the end of the summer with the gardens that were planted earlier. So don't rush it just because you think I got to get it in because it's going to be too late. Generally, the plants will catch up, and what you do to the damage of the soil and what you have to contend with for the rest of the summer isn't worth it. We talked about the kinds of things that can go in not as soon as it can be worked. I can't say now because we can't put anything in yet. Peas, onions, lettuce, spinach, beets, carrots, turnips, radishes, kohlrabi, parsnips, and chard are some of examples of common garden vegetables that can go in. And this could be like late April to early May. It's not going to be late April this year probably, but it depends on when the weather turns around and how fast it turns around and how consistent it stays after that. So we're going to have to just wait and see. I don't know what's going on this year. Mid-season crops are those that can be planted kind of in between the cold season and the warm season. Those would be broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, cauliflower. They can take a light freeze, or I shouldn't say a freeze, they can take a frost. So the temperatures can get down real close to freezing and they'll probably be okay. In central Wisconsin, that's usually mid to late May, but again, it depends on the weather. And then this late summer or late spring to early summer, the warm season vegetables, you want to wait until the soil has warmed up and the nights stay consistently pretty warm. And this could be anywhere from the end of May to the first week or week and a half in June in our part of Wisconsin, and even later as you go further north. And these would be things like melons, squashes, beans, tomatoes, peppers, okra, eggplant, corn, those type of vegetables. This is a planting guide. Let's see, I don't know if I can get this to go away here. I can't seem to do much to get it to. Nope. Anyway, what it says up in the corner is planting guide for central Wisconsin. You can see most of it, and this gives you some idea of when to approximately sow these. And this is in one of your resources too. What's the spacing between plants generally, and what's the footprint means how much space that plant takes up as it grows. So a bean plant, you can consider a space about 4 by 4 inches. That's as much space as it's going to take up. Beets are about 3 by 3. Gives you some idea of the relative size of the plant, whether or not it takes some sun or some shade and the days to harvest, and whether you would plant that plant only once in a summer, or you would plant it, could plant it several times so you have continuous harvest. So these are some of the common vegetables that are grown around here. And that's in the handout, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time looking at that. Okay, I'm going to talk now about a growing system called square foot gardening. And this was started in Nicaragua, where the soil is very poor, and they were trying to figure out how could we grow the most vegetables with the best soil that we have. And so they started with these slightly raised gardens, and they put their best soil or their amended soil into these little bit raised gardens so that there was good soil as far down as the roots would go. And then they experimented with how close together can we plant these plants so that they still grow to full size, but we don't use any extra space. And so that's how square foot gardening originally got its start. A square foot garden You don't have to have a raised bed to do a square foot garden. You can do it if you have a garden plot that's 50 feet by 100 feet, you can still divide it into rows that are not more than 3 to 4 feet wide. 4 is about the maximum. A square foot garden can be 2 by 2 feet also. So it doesn't matter how long the row is, you just don't want it any wider than 4 feet. Because the idea is you want to be able to reach in from either side of the garden and not walk in that bed and not have to have any rows where you can walk between in that bed. So dividers can be like old blind slats, wooden strips, strings anchored to small nails or eyelets on the edge of the bed. When I plant mine, I just use some garden tools with long handles on them and lay them out a foot apart both ways, and I plant in between those spaces. It doesn't have to be anything really fancy. But the idea is that you plant as many plants as you can in the spot so that they reach full maturity, but they do not crowd each other out, but they don't waste any space either. So there's like 4 planting patterns for this basic square foot gardening. And like I said, you can do this in a 50 by 100 foot garden. Just mark off 3 to 4 feet, a long row, and then have a path where you can walk, and then another 3 to 4 foot wide section. And then you will never walk in those garden beds. So there's really not a lot of reason to go through to tilling a lot of it every year. Tilling breaks down soil texture. So if you don't have to till it because you haven't walked on it and compacted it, that's a good thing too. And then each square is planted according to a species. The most is putting 16 plants in a square foot. And these would be things like radishes, carrots, and leaf lettuce. You can actually make yourself a cardboard template or something out of a sheet of plastic. And then where each black dot is here, that would be a hole. And all you do is stick a seed there, or maybe 2 in each one of those holes. Then we have a 9 plant square, and these would be things the size of beets, onions, kohlrabi, and peas. And we have a 4 plant pattern, and these would be larger plants like green beans, head lettuce, spinach, and okra. And then you have 1 square foot, which would be your largest plants like tomatoes, peppers, cabbage, broccoli, and potatoes. So this allows a plant to get enough nutrients and space to grow, but not so much that you're going to waste garden space. If you're going to grow something like a tomato in this, it must be staked or pruned though, so it stays in this space. I would not plant a whole row of tomatoes, each a foot apart. That's too close. In my garden, when I do it, I usually allow 2 squares, 2 to 4 squares for a tomato plant, because that helps spread them out and gets better air circulation between the plants, so you have better disease control. You could put 1 in a square and then surround that by squares filled with other things, and then put another one in the 3rd square. So that way it would work also. I just wouldn't put 2 tomato plants right next to each other, probably 2 pepper plants either, because they're about as big as you can get in a square foot. And so you plant, this is what a square foot garden looks like. You can imagine if you had a really long or large gardening bed, you could just continue this row. You're actually looking at probably 2 beds here, one after the other. As the plants grow, they fill the square, and that shades the soil, so you have a lot less weeding to do. It also keeps the soil more moist because it's in the shade, not the hot sun. No space is used for paths in the garden. No tilling is necessary because it's not compacted by walking on it. And generally, you only need hand tools for planting and weeding, because the plants are so close together that you may weed maybe twice maximum. And then after that, there's very few weeds to contend with. Some other things to consider when you are looking at your garden. Crops should be rotated to different places in the garden each year if you can. Now, if you have one 4x4 foot bed, you're not going to be able to rotate much, and that's the best you can do. If you have a larger garden, though, you would want to plant tomatoes one year, and then you would want to follow it maybe with beans, and then you would want to follow it maybe with cole crops like broccoli and Brussels sprouts, and then you might want to follow it with root crops like carrots and beets and lettuce, so those kinds of things. So the idea is that certain plants have certain diseases and certain pests, and if you move the plants from one part to another, it's less likely that the disease is going to follow, because if it's staying in the soil or the insects are overwintering in the soil, they have to go farther to find their host plant the next year. And so you can cut down somewhat on some of the headaches we have in gardening, like diseases and insects. But you don't want to plant within the same plant family either. Like you don't want to plant peppers and then follow that with tomatoes and then follow that with eggplant, because they're all in the same family. And these are some typical plant families that we have in gardens. The carrot family, a goosefoot family. I'm not going to try and pronounce all those Latin names. Gourd family, or the cucurbits, we sometimes call those. Corn, which is the grass family. And then we have mallow family. We have the brassicas, solanaceae, the eggplant, pepper plants, tomato plants, potato plants also belong in that family. So you get the idea that you want to plant in one space. Maybe one year you want something from this carrot family, and then maybe the next year you want the gourd family, and then maybe you want the pea family, and then maybe you want the sunflower family. And then if you planted carrots in this spot this year, you move them down the garden a little bit and just kind of keep rotating the spaces. Think about if you have vining crops like tomatoes, cucumbers, melons, squash, pole beans, peas, they do better if they're staked or trellised, a cage, a fence. It just keeps them growing upright and takes less space, and it also keeps the veggies off the ground, which keeps them from spoiling too. If you're going to be growing tall, like you're going to grow tomatoes or pole beans up a trellis, you probably want that trellis on the north side of your garden patch, because if it's growing up, it will shade shorter plants. However, you could reverse it. You could put them in the middle or on the south side of your garden if you want to shade certain garden plants like lettuce and spinach and things like that that tend to go to seed as soon as the weather gets hot. If you plant them in a little shade, the season will last longer for those vegetables. So think about where you plant the plants in relation to the direction that the sun is coming onto your garden. It's also a good idea to add a few flowers to your garden. Some common ones that we put into vegetable gardens are zinnias, marigolds, salvias, and cosmos. They draw in pollinators. And so if they come to check out the flowers, because they can see those, they're brightly colored, and they say, oh, there's a pepper plant over there. Or, oh, there's a squash growing over there. Then they will also pollinate your vegetables too. Another great source of pollinators is the dill family. If you sprinkle a little dill in your garden, that brings in some of the beneficial insects, we call them, and those are the ones that eat the bad bugs. So that's always a good thing too. And when you're doing that square foot gardening, mix up the different kinds of vegetables that are in the adjacent squares. So you plant, instead of planting 4 squares of carrots, you plant a carrot, a beet, a lettuce, and who knows, something else. And then you'll have a better control also of insects and diseases. companion planting, I often get asked about this. It's a largely unresearched theory until lately that certain plants grow better when they're growing next to other certain plants. And some plants do not like each other, we say, but they are not really researched very well. And generally it's just kind of folklore that's been handed down. There is a book in the garden list that I read recently that has a little bit different slant on it. This person is a researcher, Jessica Walliser, and she has looked up studies where people have planted certain plants together and actually studied the effects that it has. So it's a controlled study. And they have found that there are certain kinds of plants that do help other certain kinds of plants. But it's not just a haphazard thing, it's more specific than that. And they found that some plants attract specific insects that feed on those because this trap crop, the insects like that crop better than the one you're trying to grow for food. And the little bit of uncertain part about that is how far away do they have to be from the preferred crop so that the insect goes to that one, but not to the one that you want to keep for good. Peas and beans are probably good near almost any crop because they're what we call nitrogen fixers. And so they pull nitrogen out of the air and actually transport it down into the ground so that other plants can pick it up with the roots and use it. She's also found that some plants repel pests because they are strongly scented or they confuse the insects that are looking for their preferred food. So things that are strongly scented like herbs oftentimes will mask the odor of a plant that the insect is trying to find. So example, letting dill grow in between your cabbages makes it harder for that white butterfly to find your cabbages to lay those green worms on it. And so that's one way they think that specific plants sometimes help other specific plants. And some plants attract, as I said before, beneficial insects. So these are insects that actually prey on other insects and use them either for food or they insert their eggs into the insect and then their larvae actually sort of eat the pest from inside out. So that's one book, and I didn't research whether the library has that or not, but it's not a real expensive book and it is on the resource list. It's really kind of an eye-opening kind of look at companion planting. I suggest too that you make a garden map each year of what you planted in your garden so that next year you remember, oh, I planted peppers right here, and so I don't want to put peppers there again next year. So this might be a 4x8 square foot garden bed. And you can see where I've written in here different kinds of vegetables and the planting date. That's sometimes helpful to know when you planted it, so you know how long it will take before it will be ready to harvest. Some of the arrows on here, you notice the red arrows are pointing to some lower growing plants that are interspersed with the tomatoes. And those are determinate tomatoes. It's got a D on there. So I know they're not going to grow real tall, but they will be taller than the lettuce and the spinach. And by the time the tomatoes get to be pretty good sized plants, I probably will have harvested the lettuce and spinach because it's going to probably be hot by then and they're going to go to seed. So I would be harvesting those, pulling them out. So then the tomatoes actually will have about 2 squares of space around them as they get bigger. You can also see down here, you can plant along the bottom here. There might be a row of marigolds or some other flowers. You could also put, for example, the green arrow on the left side. Peas generally are an early season cool season plant, and so by midsummer they're probably done, but then you can plant lettuce later. You could probably also plant bush beans after that and still get a crop of bush beans yet by the end of the season. And then another planting technique, the blue arrow shows that there are radishes and carrots planted in that one square, and that's called interplanting. The radishes will be ready to harvest usually in 30 days or less, and it's going to take the carrots probably 2 weeks to even come out of the ground. So if you interplant you plant your 16 carrots, and then between the carrots, you plant 4 rows of radishes, you will be able to harvest and pull the radishes before the carrots really almost get going. So that's called interplanting. It's another way of extending the growing season and getting more out of your garden space. And these are some succession cropping that you might want to try. These are just a couple of examples. And then intercropping, that means planting 2 crops in one space. So that was where I planted spinach and leaf lettuce kind of between tomatoes or peppers. And you can plant garlic between a row of tomatoes and another row of tomatoes, because the garlic you'll be harvesting probably mid-July, and that's about the time the tomatoes are starting to become more full size. So they'll be taken out before the tomatoes overtake them. So those are some other things. These are a little bit more advanced techniques that starter gardeners maybe might not want to try yet. If you are short on garden space, this one shows some squash or pumpkin squash, I think. Look for these vining crops, things that says bush or small space or patio are some of the words key, that the vines are not going to get so long. They're going to be short vines. And you can see that they put a lot of things growing up in their gardens to save the space. If you don't want to do this, then don't plant these vining crops that go all over the place, like pumpkins and squash. They're real space hogs for what you get out of it. Another one that's hard to plant in a really small garden is sweet corn. You need to have at least probably an 8 by 8 foot plot of sweet corn, because it's wind pollinated. If you just have one long row of sweet corn, chances are the pollen's not going to fall on the ears the way it should, and you'll have ears that are only half kernels and stuff like that. So it also takes a lot of space for what you get. Each corn plant produces maybe 1 or 2 ears. So it's a lot of space, time, and watering for a pretty small crop. And you can usually get sweet corn at roadside stands quite easily. Let's see here. Hardening off plants. If you started your seeds from scratch, we talked about hardening off in that session. It means that you bring them outside and you gradually get them used to the outside temperatures and conditions. If they've been growing inside, they haven't had any wind, they haven't had any full sun, they haven't been exposed to temperature fluctuations, colder nights and warm days. So the leaves on those plants are pretty thin, and the cuticle, the outside covering, is also pretty thin. And so the plants have to grow some extra skin, so to speak, in order to survive outside in the elements of the weather. So what you do if you've grown them from seed is you take them out and harden them off. If you've got them from a greenhouse, ask whether those plants have been hardened off or not. If they've been growing in a greenhouse all their life and you buy them in the greenhouse and then you take them outside and just stick them in the garden, they're probably going to wither, dry up, the leaves are going to fall off. And if you're lucky, they may sprout new leaves. If you're not lucky, they won't. And so hardening off is that allowing that plant to gradually toughen up. And you start by placing the plants outside in a shady spot and wind sheltered, so they're not going to get blown around on the first day. And then over the course of about a week or 10 days, you gradually expose it to longer periods of sunlight. and more windy conditions. And by the end of those 8 to 10 days, those plants will have become accustomed to being outside. If you are afraid that critters are going to eat them up or something, cover them at night, or put them inside your garden fence. So generally, it's going to take about a week to 10 days, and then they'll be ready to plant out in the garden. Planting plants, if you're going to put them in the garden from a transplant, try to choose a cloudy, calm day or a late afternoon, because they'll be exposed to the least shock from wind and sun at that time of the day. If you can't, you can't, and that's just the way it is. But you know, if you can, it's a good idea. You're going to need to smooth the soil in your garden bed, take out all the weeds that you can find, dig a hole that's wider than the pot and about as deep as the pot. Loosen the plant from the pot and take it out of the pot. If the root ball is very crowded, kind of tease apart the roots and spread them out a little bit. And if you really can't even make any headway in doing that, just make about 3 or 4 shallow cuts around the root ball, up and down. So it's up from the soil surface down to the bottom of the roots, just shallow. And that's going to allow or tell the roots to kind of, okay, stop growing around and start growing in a different direction. And that will help. Place the root ball in the hole and adjust it for the height. So the plant is at the soil level or maybe just slightly lower. And then water the plant well and let the water to sink in. Then fill in the soil around the root ball, add some more water, especially if the soil is dry, and firm it down so that it makes good root contact and there aren't any air spaces around those roots. And then leave a slight kind of depression or dish shape around the plant to hold water. So when you water it, the water stays close to the plant, especially when it's little. This will probably kind of erode away over the summer, but at least when you started and the roots are close to the stem, the water will stay there too. Then label your plant so you know what kind of tomato it was or what kind of pepper it was or what kind of bean it was. And because you probably won't remember that unless you were following some of my directions and made a garden plan and you planted according to where they were. Then you won't have to label because you'll have it written on your garden plan. And if they're going to need supports of some kind, put those in at the time of planting so that you don't tear the roots later when you try and insert those supports into the ground around the plant. Planting seeds, a lot of the same things. Rake the soil surface smooth, get rid of all the weeds to start with, and then use the square foot planting guide to make small indentations where the seeds are supposed to go, and put those seeds in at the depth that's indicated on the seed packet. You can plant 1 seed probably per hole if you have brand new seeds. If your seeds are a year, 2 or 3 old, you might want to plant as many as 2 or 3. You can always thin them out later, but at least you're not planting like 50 seeds and then you're going to have to thin out 35 of them in order to get down to 15 plants that should only be growing there. Firm the soil over the seed and water it gently but well. Label the square or row that so you know what's in there. And then when the seedlings have 1 to 2 sets of true leaves, so not those first 2 leaves that come out, then they usually don't even look like the regular leaves on the plant. Wait till the regular leaves come and you have 2 pairs or those, then you cut off all but 1 seedling for each hole. And if you're doing it, you're not following the square foot thing and you're doing it in a row, thin to the recommended spacing. And it's so hard sometimes to pull out those little plants that have gotten a good start, or I shouldn't say pull them out, but cut them off, because if you pull them out, you're likely to pull out another one too, and the one that you wanted to keep there. And then, but think of it as making room for those plants to grow to their full size, because if they're not thinned out, they're going to never reach their full size. Watering. After you've planted, your plants are probably going to need 1 inch of rain or watering a week. So if it rains a lot, you don't have to water. If it doesn't rain at all, you're probably going to have to water. Water at the soil level to prevent disease. And so in other words, don't just take the hose and stand there and spray everything in the garden. You want to preferably use a watering can, or if you're using a hose, put it down at the soil level with minimum pressure to keep that soil from splashing up on the plants and to keep the leaves dry. Seeds should be kept moist at all times until they're germinated. And then after they're about 2 inches tall, you can gradually decrease the watering so that when you put your finger in the ground, if it's dry 1 inch down or up to the first knuckle, then it needs to be watered again. Water as needed. Do not let the weeds go to seed, especially. If you can get them before they flower and go to seed, you're going to save yourself lots of work in the future. There's an old saying that says 1 year seeding is worth 7 years weeding. So many people, kind of fall down on this, and it hurts the plants because the weeds compete for the nutrients, water, and all that sort of stuff. Plus, you're making yourself more work in future years. If you can, mulch to conserve water, keep the soil cool, and prevent weeds. Mulching is a lot less important if you do the square foot gardening, because the plants will grow and form their own cover of shade over the soil. And then be sure that you pick up any plant debris, especially diseased plant parts. If you leave them lay in the garden or leave them on the plant, if, for example, if there's diseased leaves, that's going to just promote more disease. So if you can pick those up and get rid of them, that's best. If you're doing container gardening, choose an appropriate size container for the plants. Use potting mix, not garden soil. Garden soil is way too heavy to use in pots. And make sure that the container has drainage holes in the bottom. Some sizes, if you're growing a full-size tomato plant, a 3-gallon container is the very minimum size that you're going to be able to have success with. 5 gallons or more is even better for like a large plant like that. A gallon or 2-gallon, 3-gallon can probably be used more for things like peppers. Things like lettuce and stuff can be grown in smaller pots because the roots don't go down near as far. And you have to realize that containers will need to be watered more often than in-ground plantings, because the plants have very minimum amount of place to take their roots. They can't just grow more roots or longer roots. So that's going to be up to you to provide the water for them. For recommended varieties, I think these links are also on that reference sheet. Or if you look for plant descriptions, if you're looking for shorter or container type plants, look for words like compact, patio, short vine, perfect for containers, bush, determinate. Those are some plant descriptions that clue you in that these are going to be smaller or more compact kind of plants. And there's also a reference there for shopping and selecting and planting containers. So lots of other information that we're not going to necessarily go over tonight. Other concerns: fertilize only as indicated by a soil test. Over fertilizing, especially when you first start put something out in the garden and it's quite a small plant, results many times in a lot of leaves but very little fruit. So your tomato plants or your pepper plants might look just like robust and healthy, but it's all green leaves. And that's what nitrogen does, too much nitrogen. And that's generally what's in many fertilizers for gardens. After some of the fruits start to form, when you see the little tomatoes or the little peppers or the beans start producing beans, they start flowering and producing, then you may have to add some more. generally look at how your plants look. If they're luscious and green, they're probably doing okay. If they start to look a little peaked, not so green anymore, maybe some of the bottom leaves are kind of turning a solid yellow and falling off, it means they're probably not getting enough nutrients. And then use the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium ratio recommended by the soil test. When you're weeding, make sure that you get the whole root. Otherwise, many weeds will grow back. Weeds can also attract insects, which like the weeds, and then they transfer diseases when they feed on your plants. I think I had that happen a couple of years ago. I had pepper plants that all of a sudden, all the tops look kind of twisty and funny. And I thought, well, boy, nobody's sprayed herbicides lately. And I sent a sample down to Madison and they said, you know, I think some insect was feeding on your plants and they brought in some kind of virus of some kind. He said, I can't nail down what it is. So weeds also attract, and besides competing for nutrients and things, they also attract some of those bad bugs that bring you some diseases too. Diseases, if a plant looks obviously diseased, take those leaves off, don't put them in your compost pile. Always make sure you get a diagnosis before you treat some kind of disease or insect, because the treatments are very specific to the diseases and the insects. And if you have one kind of insect and you're using the wrong kind of chemical spray, let's say, on it, you aren't going to kill the insect and you are probably going to kill some of the good guys. Insects hand picking is the preferred way if you can see the insects. I know Japanese beetles are big enough to pick, potato bugs, squash bugs, hornworms on tomatoes. And that's the best thing to do, because many of the chemicals we use to kill pest insects also kill all the good insects too. So make sure again that you know what the insect is before you do any kind of pest control, and make sure that you're using the right product. We talked about mulching, organic mulches like straw, dried grass clippings if you haven't treated your lawn, shredded leaves from your leaf pile. These are all good things to mulch your garden with. As far as flower gardens, I wouldn't mulch with rocks or stones. I also probably wouldn't put in landscape fabric, because all that does is choke the plants many times. And if you put mulch on top of that, eventually things fall into there, they decay over the winter, and pretty soon you've got a nice bed for new weeds to start growing on top of your landscape fabric. So it's just kind of a losing battle. And besides, when you pull it out, it's not recyclable anyway. Cocoa hulls is another very renewable resource. But don't let your dog eat that. Paper mulch is often good because it allows the plants to be mulched, and over the season, the paper kind of disintegrates and just goes right back into your garden. Plastic mulch should probably be eliminated, because you have to irrigate under the mulch usually, and it's not organic or compostable. I apologize for that phone, but I can't get it right now. When you go to harvesting, learn what a ripe vegetable is supposed to look like for the variety that you have. For example, there are some tomatoes that are green when they're ripe. And so at what point should you pick a bean? How long should it be? And keep harvesting to keep your plants producing. A plant's main purpose in life is to make more of itself, to reproduce. So if you keep picking off that fruit, it's going to continue to flower and produce more fruit in hopes that eventually it's going to get something that's going to reproduce for next year. Do not let fruits rot in the garden. They draw in bad insects, and they also, provide a source for disease in your garden. So make sure that you pick up the fruits that fall. take out plants that are no longer producing, throw them in their compost if they're not diseased. And you can also replant other shorter maturity plants for a second crop, like towards the end of the summer, planting more spinach and lettuce and maybe a quick producing crop of beans or peas or a second crop of broccoli. So anytime you have bare soil, that's going to be more weeding for you. Other things to think about when gardening: wear protective clothing or use sunscreen, hat, sturdy shoes, and gloves if you're going to be working around plants and particularly chemicals. Use ergonomic tools that are well maintained so they're safe. Use good body mechanics. You're going to do a lot of bending, some lifting and that sort of thing. So you want to keep your body in good shape and that you don't hurt anything so you can't work in the garden. Warm up before you start heavy work tasks, just like you would warm up before exercising. Drink plenty of water, especially if you're out in the sun and sweating. If you're using chemicals, protective gloves, boots, eyewear, that sort of thing. And if you're using chemicals, always follow the label directions exactly. The label direction is a legal piece of information. It's the law. And if you don't follow that exactly, you have no recourse from the company because they told you to do it a certain way. And if you didn't do it that way, if you get hurt or whatever, your plants get killed or something like that, it's not their fault because you didn't follow the directions. When searching the internet for garden information or for any other information about just about anything, enter your topic and then the word extension or site:.edu. And so an example might be spots on apple leaves, extension. And this will bring up information from research from various universities around the country. And that will come more to the top of the list rather than all the commercial sites. And then you choose information from a state, either if there's something there from Wisconsin, that's best. But if it's not, then things like Michigan, Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, Pennsylvania, New York, those are some of the states that have very similar growing conditions to ours. And avoid going to blogs or commercial sites to find information because those very often are not researched. They very often have someone who's trying to sell you something, and they haven't been proven and tested. So one other thing before we close, if you're looking for plants, the Wood County Master Gardener Volunteers are having a plant sale May 21st from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. It's part of the Port Edwards Garage Sale Days, and the address where the sale is going to be at is 930 Westport Drive. We will probably have vegetable and annual starter plants, potted perennials, succulents, tender bulbs, houseplants. We call them garden treasures, gently used garden tools, supplies, magazines, that sort of thing. And we will have the Ask a Master Gardener booth set up. So if you have any gardening questions, you can ask those also. So at this point, are there any questions that anybody has that I can answer further?
Like I said before, don't be shy. You can ask Donna anything.
I'm just checking the chat here. Yep. Oh, good. You have that book on Plant Partners?
We do. Our copy is checked out though, but there's a few other copies at other libraries, but
yeah. Just checking here. Yep. Okay. Any other
and you
questions?
just got to thank you in the Q&A, otherwise you didn't have any there.
I know I talk fast and a lot, so that's why I put a lot of resources on there.
Yeah, hopefully I recommend like copying and pasting those links so you can, and bookmarking them in your browser on your computers, because then you can refer back to them saying, oh, what did Donna say now? And, or, links to different things. You can always review the information when you got it.
Yeah, the learning store, the UW Extension Learning Store, a lot of those are on there. And you can send for them. They'll actually send you a copy for a small charge, but most of them are on there. They're free to download. You can download them and put them right on your computer. I mean, if you don't want to have go back to the link at all, even you can even download it. So that's one of the nice features. Any other questions out there?
Don't be shy.
I just finished reading that book. I hope maybe next year I can put a handout on there with some more specific plant combinations that they have found that actually do benefit each other that have been researched.
I think that's the nice thing about that book, is that it's science-based, like that it's actually tested and tried and true, not just old wives' tales.
Right, right. Sometimes those old wives' tales are pretty true, and sometimes they're just not. They're just that somebody was lucky in that particular instance and said, this worked really great in my garden, and then next year it doesn't work at all.
Yeah. I know, we got a quiet crew tonight, Donna.
Okay, well, we'll leave it at that then.
Yeah, well, thanks everyone for coming tonight and participating, and hopefully you learned some helpful how-tos and hints to make your garden successful this year.
Oh, if we have anybody out there that is still looking for more space to garden, in Marshfield here, we have community gardens at 3 sites. They're at First Presbyterian Church, Good Shepherd Church, and Church of Christ over on Felker Avenue. And so if people are saying, well, I'm gardening in containers now because I don't have a place to garden, if you would like a 4x8 plot, go to, let's see if I can put that in the chat here. Maybe people will have I lost it. There you go. I'll give you an email to email to this one, and the person who's monitoring that will get back to you with other information. The plots are $20. Everything is provided. You get mulch to put around your garden bed to keep the weeds down. You get compost. There's water at each site. There's even some tools if you don't have your own tools. And it's a good deal. So if you're thinking about that, expanding maybe your garden stuff, but you're not ready at this point to tear up your lawn yet and make a bigger garden, this might be something that you can do. And I'll send that out to everyone here. This is the email link. It's Gardening Together Marshfield, shortened up to MLFD@gmail.com.
That's actually really cool. That's really neat, a chance to do that, even, for somebody who, like you said, doesn't want to tear up the lawn quite yet.
Yeah. People living in apartments, I mean, where you definitely have a limited area where you could even put a garden. So
yeah. Would that be MFLD or MLFD?
oh yes, MFLD. Yes,
Okay.
You're right. MFLD. Sorry about that.
I just recognize that because we shorten everything here at the library for Marshfield too. And I was like, wait a minute.
Yeah. I'm trying to talk and type at the same time, and I can't do that.
I can't do that either.